The house fell silent when her parents handed me a contract and declared, "Sign this. All your assets now belong to the family." My wife smirked and said, "It's just a formality, babe." I leaned back and smiled. "Then you'll love what's in my safe deposit box." Their faces twisted in panic as the lawyer walked in. I met Danielle 6 years ago in Chicago during an unseasonably warm spring. I was in my late 20s, focused on my career, and had worked hard to get where I was. Real estate was my thing. I'd been flipping houses since I was 23, made smart investments in emerging neighborhoods, and built a comfortable life for myself. Nothing flashy, but solid. Secure. A 3-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park that I'd renovated myself, a modest investment portfolio, and enough savings to weather any storm. I was proud of what I'd built from scratch, especially coming from a middle-class family where I'd watched my parents struggle to make ends meet. Danielle, on the other hand, came from money, or so I thought. She had the charm, the confidence, the expensive taste that came with old wealth. We met at a charity gala I'd been invited to by a client. She stood out immediately, designer dress, perfect makeup, holding court in a circle of admirers. When our eyes met across the room, she excused herself and walked straight to me. "You look like the only interesting person here," she said with a smile that made my heart skip. "Buy me a drink?" Looking back, I should have noticed the red flag. She asked me to buy her a drink at an event with an open bar. But her hazel eyes had me mesmerized, and I was flattered by her attention. Danielle never talked about money much, but she always had the best suits, the newest gadgets, high-end everything. Her downtown penthouse apartment overlooked the lake with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Yet somehow, whenever the check came at dinner, she'd conveniently forgotten her wallet or had some excuse. Her parents, Wilhelmina and Edward, were the same way. I met them 3 months into our relationship, when Danielle took me to their estate in Lake Forest. They had that old money attitude, like they were better than everyone else. Their house was massive, sprawling across several acres, full of antique furniture and family portraits going back generations, the kind of place that screamed wealth and privilege. I wasn't some clueless, wide-eyed boy. I'd worked with wealthy clients for years, handled multi-million-dollar properties, and could spot the difference between genuine wealth and people living beyond their means. And something about Danielle's family felt off. Her parents made these little comments that set my teeth on edge. "You're so lucky to be joining our family," Wilhelmina would say, eyeing my watch as if assessing its value. "A man like you must be thrilled to have this kind of stability," Edward once remarked over brandy, emphasizing a man like you as if I were some charity case they'd taken in. I should have asked why they assumed I needed stability. I should have wondered why they seemed to think I was the fortunate one in the relationship. But I was in love, or thought I was, and it's easy to ignore warning signs when you're caught up in the excitement of a new relationship. Danielle had moments that made me uneasy too. She'd borrow money, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, and conveniently forget to pay it back. Once, when I mentioned it casually over breakfast, she laughed it off. "Don't be so uptight about money, babe. It doesn't suit you." She once suggested I put my name on a house she wanted to buy, saying it would be easier for tax reasons. When I pressed for details, she got vague and eventually dropped it. I shut that down firmly, which led to our first major fight. "Don't you trust me?" she demanded, tears welling in her eyes. I thought we were building a future together. But still, I let these things slide. I told myself it was just her upbringing, her different relationship with money. I convinced myself it didn't matter, until the night they made their move. Danielle and I had been married for 2 years when her parents invited us over for dinner at their estate. It wasn't unusual. They liked their fancy family dinners with expensive wine and long, drawn-out conversations about legacy and tradition. Danielle always seemed different around them, more reserved, eager for their approval, laughing too loudly at her father's jokes. But that night, something felt different. The moment we sat down in the formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and table set for royalty, there was this tension in the air, a barely suppressed excitement. Danielle seemed on edge, fidgeting with her napkin, checking her phone repeatedly under the table. Her mother was practically glowing, refilling wine glasses with unusual generosity. Her father, always stoic, had a satisfied look on his face, like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. Halfway through dinner, after the serving staff had brought out the main course, an elaborate rack of lamb that nobody seemed particularly interested in eating, Wilhelmina cleared her throat and pulled out a thick stack of papers from a leather portfolio beside her chair. She placed it in front of me like it was a gift, her manicured nails tapping once on the cover page. "We've been thinking about the future," Edward said, his voice warm, almost paternal, "about what's best for the family." I glanced at Danielle. She was watching me closely, waiting, her lips pressed into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to ensure stability," Wilhelmina added, sliding a Mont Blanc pen toward me, its weight substantial on the linen tablecloth. "This contract will allow us to combine our resources. One strong financial unit working together." I picked up the first page and started reading, my stomach growing colder with each paragraph. This wasn't a family agreement. It was a financial takeover. They wanted me to sign over everything. My savings, my investments, my real estate portfolio, even my personal bank accounts. All of it would be put into a family trust, which, of course, was controlled by them. The terms were clear. I would need their approval for any withdrawal over $500. Any business decision would require family consensus. My stomach twisted as I flipped through page after page of legal jargon designed to strip me of financial independence. It's just a formality, babe, Danielle said smoothly, reaching across to touch my hand. I looked at her. She was smiling like this was all normal, like I should have expected it. You trust me, don't you? Something snapped inside me. All the little red flags I'd ignored, all the uneasy feelings I'd dismissed, they crystallized into perfect clarity in that moment. I leaned back in my chair, took a breath, and smiled. Then you'll love what's in my safe deposit box. The room went silent. Danielle's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Edward's fingers clenched around his wine glass hard enough that I thought it might shatter. Wilhelmina's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath her perfectly applied blush. I watched their faces shift, their confidence waver. They had expected me to be surprised. Maybe even flattered that they wanted to include me in their financial planning. But I wasn't playing their game. What's in the box? Danielle asked, her voice tight, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. Oh, just some paperwork, I said casually, swirling the wine in my glass. A few documents. A little something I put together before we got married. For protection. The silence stretched. Then, as if on cue, the butler stepped into the room, his face impassive as always. Sir, he said, addressing me with a slight bow, your lawyer is here. I wish I had a camera to capture their faces. Danielle went pale, the color draining from her cheeks like water down a drain. Edward looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, his expression souring instantly. Wilhelmina? She just stared at me, her grip on the contract tightening until her knuckles went white. A second later, Terence, my lawyer, walked in. He was tall, imposing in his tailored suit, with the confident air of someone who knew exactly how much power he wielded. Good evening, he said, setting his briefcase down on the table with a solid thunk. I understand there's a contract my client is expected to sign. Edward was the first to recover. This is a private family matter, he said sharply, attempting to reassert control. There's no need for lawyers. Terence ignored him and picked up the contract. He flipped through it, his eyes scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. Then he let out a short laugh, the kind that contained no humor whatsoever. Wow, he said, shaking his head. This is blatant financial manipulation. Danielle shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tapping an anxious rhythm against the tablecloth. It's not like that, she started, but Terence cut her off. Actually, it is. He turned to me. If you sign this, they'd have complete control over your assets. They could drain your accounts, sell your properties, and legally, you wouldn't be able to do a thing about it. Edward's face turned red, a vein pulsing at his temple. It's just about trust, he snapped. Right, Terence said dryly. That's why it explicitly states that they have control over withdrawals, property sales, and financial decisions. But you would have no access without approval. He turned to me. Good thing you have a lawyer who actually reads the fine print. Danielle stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Why are you acting like this? She demanded, her voice rising. Her hands were shaking slightly, not with fear, I realized, but with anger. This wasn't going according to their plan, and she wasn't used to things not going her way. Why am I acting like this? I repeated, my voice calm, measured. You just tried to steal everything I own. Edward's voice turned sickly sweet as he shifted tactics. Sweetheart, this is just a misunderstanding. He placed a delicate hand over his chest like a soap opera actor trying to calm his nerves. No, I said. It's not. I took a deep breath and stood. And I think I'm done here. As I stood up to leave, Danielle grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to make a statement. Her smirk was gone, replaced with something colder, harder, a glimpse of her true self breaking through the carefully crafted facade. Don't do this, she muttered under her breath. You don't want to make enemies here. Enemies? I yanked my hand free and looked her in the eye. You already made me one. Edward suddenly switched tactics. He let out a shaky laugh and raised both hands in a placating gesture. Darling, you're overreacting. This is all a misunderstanding. I didn't say a word. He kept going, his voice taking on a concerned, almost paternal tone. We only meant to protect you. This world is dangerous. Money can be lost so easily, and we just wanted to make sure you were safe. That we were all safe. Safe. I repeated the word flatly. Right. Safe from what exactly? Myself? Terence, my lawyer, crossed his arms. If that were true, Why did you structure the trust so that my client had no control over his own money? Wilhelmina exhaled through her nose, clearly running out of patience. She glared at her husband, then at Danielle, a silent communication passing between them. This is becoming unnecessary, she said. We should just move forward like adults. I nearly laughed. Like adults? You mean like how adults try to steal from their own family? I shot back. Her face darkened, but I wasn't intimidated. The truth was their desperation was showing. They thought they had me cornered, that I would be too emotional, too shocked to think straight. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That's when Edward dropped the next bomb, his final attempt to reel me back in. I suppose, he said with a small sigh, this means you're not interested in the inheritance either. My head snapped toward him. Inheritance? The word hung in the air between us. Danielle shot her father a warning look, but it was too late. The word was already out in the open, another piece of bait dangled before me. Oh, Edward said, his voice airy and casual. Did Danielle not tell you? Her grandmother's estate. The one in Rhode Island. The family's real wealth. I felt Terrence's eyes flick toward me. He was thinking the same thing I was. This wasn't just about my money. There was something bigger at play. The estate is in probate, Edward continued, warming to his theme. And soon, we'll gain full control. But with your attitude. He tilted his head, letting his sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. I understood what he was doing. He was dangling a carrot in front of me. He thought I'd drop my guard, that I'd be tempted by the promise of more wealth, that greed would overcome my better judgment. But what I saw wasn't an opportunity. It was a pattern. This family had a history of taking things that didn't belong to them. They were always scheming, always planning to get their hands on something someone else built. And Danielle had known about this. She had kept this from me. I turned to her. Were you ever going to tell me? She ran a hand through her hair, not meeting my eyes. I was going to bring it up later. Okay? When the timing was better. Better for who? My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of betrayal. She didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. She never planned to tell me. This had always been about using me for her own ends. We left that night without another word. In the car, Terrence sighed and rubbed his temples, the gravity of the situation settling over both of us. You realize what this means, right? Yeah, I muttered, staring out at the city lights as we drove back downtown. They were after more than just my money. Exactly. He tapped his fingers against his briefcase. If this estate is as big as they're making it sound, you can bet they'll do anything to keep control of it. I stared out the window, my thoughts racing. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture I should have seen long ago. What are the odds Danielle has debt? I asked suddenly. Terrence gave me a sharp look. You think she's hiding something? I know she is. Because it all made sense now. The expensive suits, the flashy lifestyle, the way she always talked like she had money, but never actually paid for anything. And if she was in debt, then this trust wasn't just about controlling me. It was about saving herself. The next morning, I did something I should have done a long time ago. I hired a private investigator, an ex-cop named Miguel who specialized in financial fraud. I want everything, I told him in his cramped office downtown. Her finances, her credit history, her past business dealings, everything. And I want it yesterday. Miguel nodded, his expression grim. Consider it done. But I should warn you, when people like this have secrets, they're usually worse than you expect. He was right. What he found, it was worse than I thought. Danielle was drowning in debt. She had multiple credit cards maxed out, all hidden under shell companies and false names. Personal loans from private lenders at astronomical interest rates. Even a business loan she took out under my name without telling me, using a forged signature. I saw red when I read through the stack of documents Miguel delivered. Not only had she lied, she had stolen from me, committed fraud using my identity. And I wasn't about to let it slide. That night, I confronted her in our condo. She'd been distant since the dinner, spending most of her time at the office, though I now doubted she was actually working. How long have you been stealing from me? I asked without preamble as she walked through the door. Danielle blinked, her hand frozen on her purse. What are you talking about? I threw the papers onto the table, the pages fanning out like a deck of cards. You took out a loan under my name. You've been hiding debt, lying to me. And you wanted me to sign away everything so you could fix your mess. For the first time, she didn't try to deny it. She didn't try to charm her way out or cry or manipulate. Instead, she did something worse. She laughed. A cold, bitter laugh that sent chills down my spine. You were always so damn careful, she muttered, shaking her head. I thought I could make you see the bigger picture. That you'd understand we needed to be smart about our future. But you just don't get it, do you? My chest tightened. So this was always the plan? She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. You have no idea what you've just started. I took a step back, the threat implicit in her words. Are you threatening me? Danielle didn't answer. She just gave me one last look before grabbing her coat and walking out the door. I stood there, my hands clenched into fists. I wasn't scared. I was angry. And if she thought this was over, she was dead wrong. After Danielle walked out that night, I barely slept. My mind raced, piecing together every red flag, every lie, every manipulation. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had been planning this for a long time. And I had let her. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was Terrence. You need to come to my office. Now. I could hear the urgency in his voice, so I didn't ask questions. I just got in my car and drove. When I walked in, he was already waiting with a file on his desk, his expression more severe than I'd ever seen it. You're not going to like this, he warned, sliding it toward me. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. There was another man. Actually, there were two. Danielle wasn't just lying about money. She was lying about everything. Terrence leaned forward. Meet Leon and Henry. He pointed to two pictures. Two men. Both younger than me. Both stunning in that polished, Instagram model way. Leon was with her 2 years ago, Terrence explained. She promised to marry him. Took out a loan in his name and drained his savings before ghosting him. My stomach turned as I stared at the photo of a smiling young man with no idea his life was about to be destroyed. Henry was last year, Terrence continued. Same story, but she never actually broke things off with him. I stared at the pictures, trying to process. So she was cheating? Terrence nodded. While married to you, yes. But here's the kicker. He flipped to another document, a marriage license application. She was also engaged to Henry. I blinked. Wait. What? Yeah, Terrence said grimly. She proposed. Gave him a ring. Planned a wedding. He thinks he's about to marry her in 6 weeks. My mouth was dry as the implication sank in. So she was married to me, engaged to someone else, and scamming both of us? Terrence exhaled. Pretty much. And that's when it hit me. The Rhode Island estate. That inheritance her family was obsessed with. Danielle needed a husband on paper to gain access to it. That's why she kept me around. That's why she pushed for the trust. She wasn't just trying to steal my money. She was trying to replace me before I could figure it out. I need to talk to Henry, I said decisively. Terrence nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. Terrence set up a private meeting at a coffee shop the next day. When Henry walked in, I almost felt sorry for him. He was young, mid-20s probably, with a hopeful face and bright eyes. He was glowing, practically floating with excitement. He thought he had a fiancée who loved him. He had no idea he was her next target. I introduced myself, and the moment I said Danielle's name, I watched his face change, the light in his eyes dimming, replaced by wariness. How do you know her? He asked, suddenly guarded. Because she's my wife. Silence fell between us. Then, that's not possible. I placed my wedding ring on the table, the platinum band gleaming under the cafe lights. Henry's hand shook as he reached for his bag. He pulled out his ring and placed it beside mine. Identical. Down to the custom engraving inside. That's when he started crying, quiet, dignified tears that spoke of a deep and personal betrayal. After a moment, he composed himself and told me everything. Danielle had told him she was coming into an inheritance but needed to be married to secure the money. She promised that once everything was finalized, they'd move to Europe, start fresh, live a life of luxury. She had already convinced him to sign over his savings, nearly $200,000 from a trust fund his parents had set up, to help expedite the process. I clenched my fists under the table, anger boiling inside me. Do you still have contact with her? I asked. He nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. She's supposed to take me to meet her family this weekend. I exhaled slowly, a plan forming in my mind. We're going to crash that little reunion. Henry agreed to go along with my plan. We didn't tell Danielle we knew. Instead, he acted like nothing was wrong. He texted her, kept the engagement moving forward, even played along when she gushed about their future together. Meanwhile, I was working in the background. I hired a forensic accountant to dig through her finances. Turns out, Danielle had a hidden offshore account where she'd been funneling money, not just from me and Henry, but from other victims before us. The debts I found earlier? Just the tip of the iceberg. Then I dug into her parents. Remember that Rhode Island estate? Turns out, it wasn't legally theirs yet. The probate process was messy, with multiple heirs contesting the will. They needed a stable heir to gain control. A stable married heir. Danielle was supposed to be that person, presenting the perfect family image to the probate court. But now? Now I had everything I needed to burn it all down. The night of the family dinner came fast. Danielle thought she was bringing her sweet, naive fiancé to meet her loving parents. Instead, she was about to get the shock of her life. Henry and I arrived together in separate cars, coordinating our timing perfectly. I walked in first. Danielle's parents were already seated at the grand dining table, sipping wine like royalty. Edward's face twisted in confusion when he saw me, then alarm. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. I smiled, feeling a calm settle over me. I wouldn't miss family night for anything. Danielle walked in behind me, arm in arm with Henry. And then? She froze. Her face drained of color. I watched the panic settle in as her brain scrambled for a way out, for some explanation that could possibly make sense of the scene before her. "Babe," she said, forcing a smile at Henry. "Why is he here?" Henry crossed his arms. "You tell me." Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Her father stood abruptly, his napkin falling to the floor. "This is ridiculous. I won't have this drama at my table." I laughed. "Oh, trust me. You'll want to hear this." I turned to Terence, who was standing quietly by the doorway. "Would you like to begin?" He stepped forward and pulled out his files. "Let's start with fraud," he said, flipping to the first page, "and then we'll get to felony identity theft." The room exploded. Edward gasped. Wilhelmina slammed her glass down so hard that red wine splashed across the white tablecloth like blood. Henry threw his engagement ring at Danielle's chest, where it bounced off and rolled under the table. And Danielle? Danielle just sat there, staring at me with a look I'll never forget. Pure, unfiltered hatred. She knew I had destroyed her. And the best part? I wasn't finished yet. Silence descended on the room. Not the kind of silence where people are processing information. Not the kind where someone is waiting to speak. This was the kind of silence before a bomb explodes. Danielle sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Her father's face twisted in a mixture of horror and fury, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to scream, but couldn't find the right words. Her mother just stared ahead, the weight of everything sinking into her face like years of bad decisions hitting all at once. "Fraud?" Edward spat, regaining his voice. "This is absurd. Where did you even get this ridiculous claim?" Terence, calm as ever, placed a thick folder onto the table and slid it toward them. "It's all in there," he said simply. "Bank records, loan documents, forged signatures, and, oh," he reached for another paper, "proof that Danielle took out a business loan under her husband's name without his knowledge. That alone is a felony." Danielle flinched, but Edward slammed his hand on the table. "This is a family matter," he snapped. "No," I said, my voice level. "This stopped being a family matter the moment you tried to steal from me. This is a legal matter now." And then Henry spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. "And what about the identity theft and fraud? What about all the lies?" He demanded, arms crossed. "Because last time I checked, she was supposed to be honest with me, not some lying, married scam artist who stole my life savings." Danielle finally moved. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood, her composure cracking. "Henry," she said carefully, her voice soft, using that same soothing tone she'd used on me countless times. "I can explain." He let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I'd love to hear this." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair, eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape. "Okay. Fine," she muttered. "Yes. I was seeing you while I was still married, but it wasn't what you think. My marriage to him was over long ago." She gestured toward me without looking. "We were just dragging things out." I scoffed. "Dragging things out? You literally tried to trick me into signing over my entire net worth last week. Sounds pretty active to me." Henry turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "So everything you told me was a lie? The future, the wedding, his voice broke for a second. "You told me I was the one." For a moment, something flashed in Danielle's eyes. Regret? Panic? It was hard to tell. "I meant it," she said. "I wanted us to have a future, Henry." "While you're still married," he snapped. No answer. The truth hung in the air, damning in its silence. Edward, still fuming, turned on me. "You set this up," he accused. "You're trying to ruin us." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Ruin you? You did that yourselves. I just put the truth on display." Danielle had been silent too long. That's when I knew she was about to snap. "You think you've won?" she finally said, her voice low. Everyone turned to look at her. She wasn't panicked anymore. She was angry. "You act like you're the victim here," she growled, eyes locked onto me. "But let's be honest, this was always about power for you. You liked feeling superior. You liked keeping everything locked away, so I had to come to you for money." I raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting way to describe me protecting my finances from a compulsive liar." Her nostrils flared. "You never trusted me. You never gave me a reason to. I was your wife." She exploded, slamming her fist onto the table so hard the glasses rattled. "You were supposed to stand by me, not turn on me like this." Henry took a step back, clearly shocked by the outburst. Edward looked shaken. Wilhelmina, for the first time that night, spoke. "Sit down," she ordered. Her voice was quiet, but the authority in it was clear. Danielle hesitated, chest rising and falling fast. Then, slowly, she sank back into her chair. Terence cleared his throat. "Since emotions are high, let's cut to the chase," he said, flipping through his notes. First, he held up a document. "Henry has already reported the fraud regarding the money taken from him. That's one charge against you, Danielle." Her jaw clenched, a muscle working in her cheek. "Second," he continued, "we have already spoken to law enforcement about the fraudulent business loan. And considering the forged signature, that's another charge." Edward gasped. "You? You went to the police?" "Of course," I said, staring at Danielle. "Did you really think I was just going to let you walk away?" Her hands curled into fists on the table. "Third," Terence went on, completely unfazed, "the Rhode Island estate, that inheritance you were banking on? It seems probate court has some interesting information about how deep in debt this family really is." Wilhelmina's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" Terence smiled slightly. "Oh, you didn't know? Your assets are frozen pending investigation." The air shifted. Edward's face drained of color. "No. That's not possible." "It is," Terence said. "Turns out, the real reason you wanted my client to sign everything into a family trust was because you needed his money to pay off your debts before the probate court discovered them." Edward shot up from his seat, panic finally breaking through his aristocratic facade. "This is a lie." But the way his voice cracked, he knew. Wilhelmina knew. Danielle knew. They were done. Edward was the first to break completely. He turned to Danielle, his voice sharp, his eyes furious. "You idiot," he hissed. "You had one job. You were supposed to make this work. And now? We're ruined." Danielle flinched as if he'd struck her. "Don't put this all on me," she snapped back. "This was your plan just as much as mine. And you were supposed to execute it." He screeched, his carefully cultivated image of sophistication crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. Wilhelmina rubbed her temples, looking 10 years older than she had at the beginning of the evening. The perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the lines of worry etching themselves into her face. Henry, still shaking with emotion, turned to me. "I want her arrested." "Don't worry," I said. "It's already in motion." Danielle's head snapped toward me, real fear in her eyes for the first time. "You wouldn't." I met her stare. "Watch me." And that's when the sirens wailed outside, the blue and red lights flashing through the dining room windows, casting the scene in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Danielle was arrested that night. Fraud, identity theft, multiple counts of financial manipulation. There was plenty to work with. Her parents weren't charged, but their reputation was destroyed. The estate they'd been fighting for went into foreclosure within months, their years of financial deception finally catching up to them. Henry and I? We went out for drinks the next day and toasted to the fact that we'd finally gotten justice. He was able to recover some of his money, though not all of it. I filed for divorce immediately and was granted an expedited process given the circumstances. Some people say revenge isn't worth it. That you should take the high road and let karma handle things. I disagree. Sometimes, revenge is exactly what's needed, not out of spite, but out of justice. Not to wound, but to heal. As for me? I'm rebuilding. Stronger boundaries. Better instincts. And a safe deposit box that's a little emptier now that its contents have served their purpose.